Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. I sold my house for my child only to be met with betrayal and a shocking twist. I am Margaret Collins, 66, and I sold the Savannah house where my rosebush bloomed wild every summer so my son could have a bigger life. Days after I moved in, he told me I had ruined their lives and to get out. When a banker asked me to confirm a $240,000 loan I had never requested, I understood someone inside my own walls had forged my name. That night, I pressed record and heard my child say life would be easier if I were dead. At dawn, I set a wooden box on their table with the deed in my name, the fraud papers, and a USB closed the door and walked toward a different life. A week later, my phone showed 99 missed calls while federal agents opened a case. This is how betrayal became the twist that finally set me free. I stayed awake longer than I wanted that first night, my body restless, my mind circling the same question over and over. Had I made the right decision by leaving everything behind? In Savannah, my days had been steady, if not a little lonely. I had my church group, my garden familiar streets where neighbors waved even if they did not know my name. Here, I had only the hollow sound of this new house, and the hope that my sacrifice would be enough to earn me belonging. When sleep finally came, it was shallow and fractured. I dreamed of the rose bush by my old fence, the one that grew wild every summer, no matter how hard I trimmed it back. In the dream, I bent down to water it, but when I poured from the can, only sand spilled out. The petals crumbled into ash in my hands. I woke with my heart pounding and the sheets damp from sweat. The second morning in Orlando began with Rebecca's footsteps on the stairs. I rose quickly, eager to show I could fit in, to prove I was not a burden. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee before she entered the kitchen, hoping the small gesture might soften her edges. She looked at the pot, then at me, her lips curving into something that was not quite a smile. She poured a cup and walked away without a word. I told myself not to be discouraged. Silence, I thought, is better than anger. Dan came down a few minutes later, his tie crooked, his hair still damp from the shower. Ethan ran circles around him, chasing a toy car across the floor. Dan leaned against the doorway, watching me pour my own cup of coffee. His eyes softened for a moment. I almost reminded him of the nights I used to wait up until he got home from high school football practice, a sandwich and a glass of milk ready on the counter. But before I could speak, Rebecca called his name from upstairs, her voice clipped. He pushed away from the doorway and left without finishing the thought in his eyes. I carried my cup outside and sat on the porch. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass mixed with the faint sweetness of orange blossoms from a neighbor's yard. Ethan followed me with his bucket and stick, pretending to be an explorer. He asked me to watch as he dug little trenches in the dirt, explaining they were rivers leading to the sea. I told him he had a fine imagination, that maybe one day he would build real bridges and real cities. His grin stretched wide, but then Rebecca's voice carried out from the kitchen window. "Time to come inside, Ethan." He dropped his stick and scampered off, leaving me alone with the stillness. I thought back to when Dan was Ethan's age. He had loved building forts in the living room with couch cushions and blankets. I would step over his creations for days, careful not to knock them down, because he insisted they were castles that could never be destroyed. Once Richard laughed and said we should charge rent for all the kingdoms taking over our house. Dan had puffed out his chest and declared he would pay us in treasure when he grew up. I smiled at the memory, then felt the smile fade as I realized what I had given up now was more than treasure. That afternoon, Rebecca asked if I could use the downstairs bathroom instead of the one near the bedrooms. She said it would just make things simpler with Ethan's routine. I nodded without hesitation, though inside, I felt the line being drawn a little deeper. Each request was small, harmless on the surface, but together they carved out less and less space for me. At dinner that evening, I placed a napkin in front of the seat I had chosen, trying to claim it gently without words. Rebecca reheated pasta, the smell of garlic filling the room. She served Dan, then Ethan, then herself. The napkin in front of me stayed untouched. Dan said he would fix something for me later. I wanted to argue to remind him that I had spent decades feeding him before he ever learned to boil water, but the words stayed trapped. Ethan looked from me to his father, confusion flickering in his young eyes. He did not speak either. After they finished eating, I washed my own dish, the clatter of water against porcelain, sounding too loud in the quiet kitchen. I wiped the counter, straightened the chairs, all while fighting the urge to cry. Mothers are not supposed to cry in front of their children, even when those children are grown men. That night, I opened my small notebook again. My handwriting wavered as I wrote day 1 and 2. I gave up my home, my independence, the comfort of everything I knew. In return, I have received silence and empty space at the table. I closed the book carefully, as if slamming it might break something fragile inside me. Back in bed, I listened to the house settle around me. From the hallway, I heard Dan and Rebecca's muffled voices. I could not make out the words, but the sharp edges carried clearly. A door closed firmly. Then Ethan whimpered in his sleep, a sound so soft I doubted anyone else could hear it. I waited for Dan to comfort him, for Rebecca to hum him back to rest, but no one came. The house returned to silence. I pressed my palm to the cool sheet and repeated the words Dan had spoken in the driveway when we arrived. "You will always have a place here, Mom." I said them again and again until they lost shape, until they were just sounds floating in the dark. I wanted to believe them. I needed to. But even then, deep in the quiet, a small voice inside me asked what would happen if those words turned out to be a promise already broken. The morning light in Orlando came in thin streaks through the flimsy blind, sharp and unforgiving. I rose slowly, my back stiff from the mattress that had no memory of me. The small room smelled of new paint mixed with dust, a space that had been converted from an office but still carried the sterile air of papers and printers. My suitcase leaned against the wall untouched. I had not found the will to unpack. Something about keeping it zipped gave me comfort, as though I might still turn around and go back to Savannah if things became too heavy to bear. Rebecca passed me in the hallway with a polite nod that felt more like an afterthought. She was carrying laundry and avoided my eyes. I followed the sound of dishes to the kitchen and found Dan already at the table with Ethan. My grandson was trying to balance a spoon on his nose, his laughter bubbling up and spilling across the room. For a brief second, my heart lifted. Then I noticed only 3 plates on the table. I moved toward the counter and began searching for another plate, but Rebecca brushed by me, reaching first, her movements quick and precise. She set it down with a small clatter, not in front of me, but on the far end of the counter. No words were exchanged. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the pot, the steam fogging my glasses, and sat at the edge of the table. Dan looked tired, the lines around his mouth deep. He pushed scrambled eggs onto Ethan's plate and told him to eat quickly before school. When his eyes met mine, there was no warmth, only a heaviness that made me feel as though I had walked in at the wrong moment. I thought of mornings in Savannah when I would sit across from him, making sure he ate before running to catch the bus. I had made his favorite toast with peanut butter and honey, always cutting it into squares, because he claimed triangles made him nervous. Now he was a man, and yet the sight of him across the table stirred the same instinct in me. I wanted to care for him. He no longer wanted it. That day stretched on quietly. I tried to keep busy folding a few towels left in the dryer, straightening the magazines in the living room. Each time Rebecca appeared, she would adjust something behind me as if erasing the proof I had been there. By late afternoon, I retreated to my room, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at my closed suitcase, wondering if I should unpack or if keeping it ready was a safer choice. Dinner arrived too quickly. Rebecca reheated something in the microwave, the beeping cutting through the quiet like sharp notes. Dan came home later than expected, his tie loose, his eyes already clouded with frustration. I offered to set the table, but my words fell flat. Rebecca had already placed 4 plates, one for each of them. I hesitated in the doorway, waiting for her to bring a 5th. She did not. I walked to the cabinet, pulled out a plate, and set it gently at the far corner. My hands trembled slightly, though I tried to hide it by smoothing the tablecloth. Ethan ran in carrying his toy car, his cheeks flushed from play. He smiled at me, and for a moment I felt anchored. We sat down. The food was simple pasta and bread. Rebecca served Dan first, then Ethan, then herself. The 4th plate she had set earlier remained empty. Mine. I waited, hoping she would notice, but she kept her eyes fixed on her own dish. Dan finally looked at me, his face unreadable. I asked softly if I could have some pasta. He exhaled sharply and scooped a small portion onto my plate. His hand shook as he set it down, and the fork clattered. Ethan looked between us with wide eyes, sensing the tension he could not name. The silence grew thick until Dan broke it. His voice was low at first, then rose sharp and cutting. He said that since I had moved in, everything had changed. Ethan no longer had enough space. He and Rebecca were constantly rearranging their lives because of me. His words struck like blows, one after another, each heavier than the last. I tried to respond to tell him I had given up my home so he could have this one. Before the words could form, he slammed his hand on the table. The plates rattled. Ethan jumped. Dan's face was red, his eyes narrowed. He shouted that I had ruined their lives, that I had brought nothing but disruption, that I should just get out. The air left my chest in a rush. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Rebecca stayed silent, her gaze fixed on the table as though she were not part of the moment. Ethan whimpered, pushing his pasta around without eating. I stared at Dan, truly seeing him for the first time, as a man no longer softened by youth or obligation. His anger was not a flash, but a steady burn, a resentment that had been waiting beneath the surface. The little boy in the photograph on my dresser, the one reaching for a balloon, felt like a stranger. I placed my fork down gently, hands steady though my heart pounded. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the truth revealed. The son I had sacrificed for was gone. In his place was someone who looked at me and saw only burden. That night, I sat in my small room again, the suitcase still closed, the photo album under my pillow. The words he had shouted replayed in my head, scraping against every memory I carried of him as a child. I wrote them down in my notebook, pressing hard enough that the pen nearly tore the page. "You ruined our lives. Get out!" I closed the book and slid it under the mattress. Then I turned off the light, lay down on the stiff bed, and stared into the dark, the sound of my own breath loud in the silence. I told myself tomorrow would be different, though. In my bones, I knew the promise had already cracked beyond repair. The morning arrived heavy with Florida heat, even before the sun had fully cleared the roofs of the houses around us. I pushed myself out of bed, determined to step into this day differently to be useful to prove I could fit in. My suitcase still leaned unopened against the wall, a reminder that I was not yet settled, but I ignored it and made my way toward the kitchen. Rebecca was already there, her back to me, the coffee machine humming on the counter. I offered to make breakfast, my voice careful, polite. She glanced over her shoulder, then returned her focus to the pan in front of her. No words, only the quick scrape of a spatula. I busied myself washing the few cups in the sink, drying them until they gleamed. When I placed them neatly in the cabinet, she stepped forward and moved them to a different shelf. It was such a small thing, but the dismissal stung like a slap. Dan came down with Ethan trailing behind him, still in his pajamas, hair sticking up in every direction. My grandson ran to me with a grin, but Rebecca called his name sharply, and he slowed, climbing onto a chair instead. Dan pressed a kiss to the top of his son's head, then looked at me. For an instant, I thought I saw the boy he once was, the boy who had begged me to stay in the stands until every game ended. But the look passed, quickly replaced by something harder. He muttered that he was late for work, and the front door closed behind him with a final thud. I decided to spend the morning outside. The flower bed in front of the house was overrun with weeds, and I thought perhaps tending to it might make me feel useful. The soil crumbled easily in my hands, the scent of earth rising sharp in the warm air. I hummed quietly, remembering the afternoons in Savannah when Richard teased me for talking to the roses as though they could hear. A shadow fell across me, and I looked up to see a woman walking a small terrier along the sidewalk. She wore a bright visor and moved briskly, but she slowed when she noticed me. I smiled, lifting a hand in greeting. Her lips curved faintly, but her eyes slid past mine. She gave the smallest nod, then tugged on the leash and quickened her pace. I watched her go, confusion prickling at my chest. Later, I asked Rebecca about her. She was unpacking groceries in the kitchen, stacking boxes in neat rows. I mentioned that the neighbor had seemed distant. Rebecca's knife paused for just a second as she sliced vegetables. Then she said Linda was nice enough, but did not care for people who liked to meddle. She said it lightly, almost idly, but her eyes flicked toward me before she bent over her cutting board again. The implication sat heavy. I had exchanged barely a handful of words with this Linda, yet already something had been planted. I swallowed the protest that rose in my throat, knowing it would find no welcome. At dinner, Rebecca mentioned to Dan that Linda thought I seemed a little hard to live with. She laughed softly, but Dan's jaw tightened. He turned his gaze on me, cool and searching. My fork hovered uselessly above my plate. I wanted to defend myself, to say the woman did not know me, but the silence around the table warned me not to bother. The following days grew lonelier. When I tried to join Ethan in the living room, Rebecca told him not to disturb me, saying Grandma needed her rest. When I offered to read him a story, she pulled him gently toward her, saying he had homework to do. Each time I saw his small face crumple with confusion, and each time he obeyed. One afternoon I sat by the window with a book open on my lap. Through the glass I heard voices, Linda's clear and sharp, Rebecca's lower but unmistakable. They stood just beyond the fence. My name carried to me like an arrow, followed by words I could not miss. Difficult, complaining, a burden. Then came laughter, quick and easy. My stomach clenched. I closed the book without realizing I had not read a single line. That night I wrote in my notebook, Day 3. Rebecca speaks to neighbors. Linda believes I am hard to live with. My son looks at me like I am the problem. The pen dug into the page, carving the letters deep enough to leave indentations on the next sheet. The small kindnesses I tried to offer seemed invisible. When I folded laundry, Rebecca refolded it. When I swept the porch, Dan asked if I had moved the broom. I began to wonder if the very air I breathed was considered intrusive. Then one evening, as I brushed my hair in my small room, Ethan appeared in the doorway. He held something behind his back, his eyes darting nervously toward the hallway. He stepped inside, grinning, and placed a small plastic dinosaur into my hand. The paint was chipped at the tail, its surface worn smooth. He whispered that it was mine now, that I should keep it safe. Before I could respond, he darted away, quick as a shadow. When I pulled back the covers that night, something crinkled beneath my pillow. My fingers closed around a folded piece of paper. I opened it carefully. In uneven crayon letters, jagged but determined, it read, "I love you, Grandma." The tears came before I could stop them. I pressed the note against my chest, my heart aching with gratitude and sorrow all at once. In a house where my presence felt erased, here was proof that I still mattered. I slid the note between the pages of my notebook, tucked safely among my harsher entries, a reminder that truth carried many forms. Then I placed the dinosaur on the nightstand beside me, its small painted eyes watching over the dark. For the first time since arriving, I allowed myself to exhale deeply. In the quiet, I felt not entirely alone. Ethan's small gesture glowed like a candle against the growing shadows. I closed my eyes with the sound of his whispered words echoing in my mind, soft and certain, the fragile tether that kept me from drifting into despair. The morning gathered itself around the house with a dull hum from the air conditioner and the faint clink of dishes in the kitchen. I moved slowly, careful not to wake the ache in my back, and held on to the small warmth that Ethan had given me the night before. I made my bed, lined my slippers side by side, and reached for the plastic dinosaur on the nightstand, as if it were a good luck charm. The moment I set it down, my phone buzzed across the dresser. A local number flashed on the screen that I did not recognize. I answered with a cautious hello, and a woman introduced herself as Marjorie Klein from First National Bank of Florida. Her voice was steady and professional. She said she needed to confirm a few details regarding a home equity application under my name. She asked for the last 4 digits of my social. I gave them, my mouth suddenly dry. She said the files showed a request for $240,000 secured by the Orlando property and that the application was missing tax returns. I told her I had not applied for any loan. There was a silence that carried weight. She suggested I come to the branch that morning so we could look together. I agreed before I had time to think. After we ended the call, I stood very still, listening to the low drone of the air and the distant sound of Rebecca moving in the kitchen. I slipped the phone into my purse and walked down the hall. Rebecca glanced up when I entered the room, then looked past me to the window. I said I would be stepping out for a few errands. She said nothing, only shifted a stack of mail away from my side of the counter. I poured a small cup of coffee and could not bring myself to drink it. The smell made my stomach turn. The bank sat on a corner where the road widened near a strip mall. Inside, the air was bright and cold. A row of chairs faced a counter with small glass partitions. A woman with silver hair and kind eyes approached me and introduced herself as Marjorie. She led me to a small office with a glass wall and asked to see my identification. I handed over my license, and she scanned it, the machine chirping once as it accepted the image. She thanked me, then opened a manila folder on the desk between us. There were neatly clipped pages inside. On top lay an application with my name printed clearly, my date of birth, my social security number, my current address, the Orlando property address, and a stated income that looked like a guess gathered from old numbers. There was also an email address that I did not recognize and a phone number that was 1 digit off from mine. The loan amount read $240,000. The purpose line said debt consolidation and home improvement. I could feel the beat of my pulse in my wrists. Marjorie turned a page. There was a form authorizing the bank to pull my credit. At the bottom was my name written in cursive and a signature that was wrong in ways only I would notice. The slope of the G leaned the opposite direction. The loop on the M was too large. I never used a period after my middle initial, and there it was a dot that did not belong to me. The neatness of it chilled me. It was a careful performance, but not careful enough. I heard my voice ask calmly what the next steps would be if I stated that these signatures were forged. Marjorie said they had already paused the file pending verification because the tax return request had gone unanswered and the phone number had bounced once. She said the bank could mark the application as suspected identity theft and that I could sign an affidavit so their fraud department would have grounds to stop any further processing. She slid a stack of papers toward me and a pen that felt heavier than it should have. I read slowly, letting each sentence settle. The words were dry and formal, but I understood their meaning well enough. I filled in the lines with my careful handwriting, signed my real name where it belonged, and dated each page. Marjorie made copies and clipped them into the folder. She asked if I wanted copies for myself. I said yes. She placed them into a new envelope and wrote my name on the front in a tidy hand. I asked how this could have happened. Her eyes met mine and held there for a moment. She said gently that this kind of thing was unfortunately common when personal information was accessible to someone in close proximity. I thanked her, though the words scratched my throat on the way out. She said their team would contact me within a few days, and that if I saw anything unusual on my statements, I should call immediately. I nodded and stood the room swaying briefly as I tucked the envelope under my arm. The heat outside hit me like a wall. I walked to my car and sat without turning the engine on. The door closed. The world narrowed to the small space that held me. I opened the envelope and looked again at the careful lies. The handwriting sat on the page like an impersonation that almost fooled everyone. Almost. The not quite right curve of my name mocked me. I pictured my suitcase back in the small room, how it had been moved from where I left it one afternoon, how the zipper had not lain flat. I pictured the drawer where I kept the binder with old returns and copies of my license from when I had to renew. My mind moved through the house, through every place a person who lived with me could have found what they needed. Only someone inside could have known these things. The Orlando address, the timing of my move, the exact name I used on certain accounts, and the years of employment listed on the form. I felt the world tilt as if I were standing at the edge of a dock, and the water had shifted under my feet. I pressed the envelope closed and rested my palm on it as if I could hold the truth steady by force. I started the engine and drove slowly back, hands tight on the wheel. The streets of the subdivision looked too bright, every lawn trimmed to an impossible sameness. When I pulled into the driveway, Ethan's bicycle lay on its side in the grass. Inside the house held the same cool air and quiet hum, but it felt different to me now, like a stage set where I had finally seen the ropes and pulleys behind the curtain. In my room, I slid the envelope beneath the notebook that had already begun to hold my days like a ledger. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened for the sounds of the rest of the house. Drawers opened and closed down the hall. Water ran. A door clicked. I waited for the right moment, then walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. Rebecca stood by the counter scrolling her phone. I said I had taken care of my errand. She nodded without looking up. The refrigerator motor kicked on a low, steady hum that filled the silence between us. Back in my room, I took out one page at a time and studied it again. The numbers. The misspelled street name on one line that matched the way Dan had once spelled it on a package. The contact email that used a variation of my name I had never used, but that I had heard Rebecca float once when she suggested creating a family email for me. I let each clue settle until they began to form a shape that I could not unsee. When the afternoon thinned into evening, I placed the pages back into the envelope and tucked it deep in the back of the dresser beneath a stack of sweaters. I set the plastic dinosaur on top of the drawer as if it were a sentry. Then I opened my notebook and wrote the facts in careful lines. Local banker called early morning. Application for $240,000 against Orlando property. Signature not mine. Email and phone number do not match. Bank flagged as suspected identity theft. Copies in my possession. I ended the entry with a single sentence that made my hand tremble. Only someone inside the house could have done this. I closed the notebook and sat very still. The house creaked once and then went quiet. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower started up and droned, then faded into distance. I could taste metal at the back of my mouth, the sign that my body understood a danger my mind was only beginning to name. I smoothed the cover of the notebook with my palm, felt the raised edge of the spine under my fingertips, and knew the day had changed more than just the contents of a file at a bank. I stood turned off the light and let the room fall into dimness. The envelope lay hidden. The dinosaur kept its silent watch. I sat on the bed and listened to the small sounds of the house that no longer felt like a home, and I pictured the neat false curves of my name on a page that was meant to take from me what I had already given. By late afternoon, my resolve felt steady enough to carry me through whatever might follow. I took the envelope from its hiding place, checked that the copies were inside, then tucked it into my purse. I stood in the doorway of my small room and listened to the house breathe. The air conditioner hummed, water ran in the upstairs bathroom, a cabinet closed somewhere down the hall. I told myself that this would not be a scene of begging or pleading. This would be simple and plain, a statement of fact, a line drawn cleanly. Rebecca called everyone to dinner. The smell of reheated stew drifted through the kitchen thick with starch and garlic. I set my purse at my feet and took the same seat I had been taking since I arrived, a corner spot with a view of the hallway. Dan came in a few beats late, shoulders tight, expression already set. Ethan clambered into his chair, careful, as if he understood that even the scrape of wood on tile might be too loud. Before any plates were passed, I placed my phone on the table with the screen facing up so the small red dot was visible. I said calmly that I was going to record our conversation for clarity, and that if anyone preferred not to be recorded, they could say so now. No one spoke. Dan stared at the phone, then at me, then shrugged in a way that read like contempt. Rebecca looked down at her bowl and adjusted her napkin. I pulled the envelope onto my lap and opened it. I kept my hand steady as I laid the first page in the center of the table. I said that the bank had called that morning about a home equity application in my name for $240,000 secured by this house. I said that I had not applied for any loan. I pushed the page closer so Dan could see the large print of my name and the careful signature that did not belong to me. He did not touch the paper. He said there must be some confusion and that banks get things wrong all the time. He told me not to worry about it. His voice was too smooth at first, like someone trying a story on for size. I slid the second page over the first. I said that the application used a phone number 1 digit off from mine, listed an email I did not recognize, and spelled our street name exactly the way he had misspelled it on a package a month earlier. I kept my tone even. I said the bank had flagged the file and marked it as suspected identity theft, and that I had signed an affidavit to stop further processing. Color rose along his neck. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and told me that we were family and that family shares. He said he and Rebecca were drowning, that bills had stacked up, that his credit was ruined, and Rebecca's hours at the hospital were inconsistent. He said I lived here and benefited from the roof like everyone else, and that it was selfish to act separate. He said I had given us the down payment and then expected the rest of us to carry the whole load, while I sat in the spare room and made judgments. I looked at the page again at the neat loops of a name that was not mine. I said that helping is not the same as being taken from. I said that forging a signature is not sharing. I said someone who lives in this house had access to the information used on that application. Rebecca's spoon halted in midair. She set it down without a sound. Ethan's legs swung under his chair. He looked at his father with a small crease between his eyebrows. Dan leaned forward, hands flat on the table. He said I was ungrateful. He said I had ruined their plan for stability. He said if I cared about this family, I would fix this with the bank and sign whatever needed signing, and that the sooner I accepted that, the better it would be for everyone. I pointed to the red dot on the phone screen and said that the recording was capturing his words. I said we were all responsible for what we chose to say. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Then he slammed his palm down so hard the bowls rattled. Ethan jumped the spoon, clattering against ceramic. Dan's voice rose raw at the edges. He said nothing had gone right since I arrived. He said Ethan's room was too small now, and that he and Rebecca had no privacy, and that every day felt like stepping over my things and my needs and my opinions. He said, if I would not help, then life would be easier if I simply were not here at all. He said that if I were dead, it would solve everything. Time slowed for me in that second. I watched a drip of stew slide down the side of his bowl and pool on the tablecloth. I noticed how Rebecca's fingers curled into her napkin. I heard Ethan make a small sound, more breath than voice. The words themselves did not strike like lightning. They sank like stones. I took in one long breath and let it out. I gathered the pages, tapped them into a neat stack, and placed them back in the envelope. I said that the bank would proceed with their fraud review and that I had copies of everything. I said that we would not be discussing this further at dinner. Dan told me I had no right to threaten him in his own home. I said it was my name on the deed. I kept my tone quiet. I did not raise my voice. The red dot on the phone glowed steady between us. He shoved his chair back, the legs screeching against the tile. For a moment I thought he would sweep the papers to the floor or reach for the phone, but he did neither. He stood there, breathing hard, fists clenched, looking past me at something that was not in the room. He muttered that I would regret this and that I was tearing the family apart. He turned and walked down the hall. A door upstairs slammed with a dull thud that trembled through the ceiling. Rebecca rose without meeting my eyes. She told Ethan it was time for a bath. He slid off his chair, slowly glancing back at me, as though he could not reconcile the shape of his father's anger with the woman who read him stories in the afternoon. They disappeared down the hall, their footsteps soft and unsure. The kitchen went quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I reached over and stopped the recording. The red dot disappeared. I stood and carried my plate to the sink. The water ran warm over my hands. I washed the dish, dried it, and placed it in the cabinet with care. I wiped the table where the stew had dripped, scrubbing until the stain faded. The motion steadied me. In my room, I set the phone on the dresser and laid the envelope beside it. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the beat of my heart in my fingertips. The plastic dinosaur watched from the nightstand like a tiny guardian. I opened my notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date. Then I wrote down what had been said, the order of it, the tone of it, the way the room had felt. I noted that the recording existed and that the bank documents were safe. I wrote the sentence that I could not stop hearing in my head, not as a wound, but as a record. When I set the pen down, the house seemed to tilt back into balance. Not comfort, not safety, but a certain clarity. I understood that a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed, and that I had moved from hoping for kindness to preparing for consequence. I closed the notebook and slid it under the mattress with the others. I checked the lock on my window, though I was not sure why. I dimmed the light and let the room settle around me. From down the hall came the faint splash of bath water, a small laugh, then the murmur of a bedtime story read in a hurried voice. The sounds faded and the house eased into its restless silence. I lay back without undressing, one hand resting on the pillow where I had hidden too many truths already, and felt the hard rectangle of the phone against my palm. The night pressed close. I listened for sleep and for whatever came next. Morning arrived like a weight on my chest. The house hummed with the same mechanical calm, but the air felt thinner, as if the argument at dinner had burned through the oxygen and left a residue I could not wipe away. I rose, smoothed the bed, and reached for the small dinosaur on the nightstand. Its chipped tail felt solid in my palm. I set it down and told myself to move slowly, to notice everything, to keep my balance. In the kitchen, Rebecca stood with her back to me, stacking plastic containers on the counter. She said the kitchen would be easier to manage if we kept things streamlined. She said from now on, breakfast and dinner would be handled by her, and that I should avoid using the stove so there would be less chaos with Ethan. She did not look at me when she said it. She closed the pantry door and snapped a small latch I had not seen before. I stared at it, surprised by the click, and felt something small inside me follow suit. I poured a cup of coffee and reached for the sugar. The jar was not where it had been. I opened one cabinet, then another. In each one, items had shifted as if the room itself had decided to erase my muscle memory. I stirred the coffee black and tried to drink it, but it tasted like a dare. Back in my room, I nibbled on a sleeve of crackers I had tucked into my suitcase, more out of habit than hunger. By noon, I was ready to fix a small sandwich. The bread was missing. The knife drawer stuck and then slid open to reveal empty grooves where the knives had been. The refrigerator shelves had new labels in Rebecca's tidy handwriting. Top shelf for Dan and Rebecca. Middle shelf for Ethan's lunches. Bottom shelf for meal prep. I found a single yogurt cup with my name written on the lid in marker. I took it to my room and ate it slowly with a plastic spoon from a takeout bag I had saved. The small denials added up. The living room remote vanished and reappeared 2 days later without batteries. The throw blanket I had used for my afternoon rest disappeared into a donation box by the door. My vitamins were replaced with a generic brand that made my stomach upset. When I asked about the change, Rebecca said it was a better value and that I should be grateful someone was keeping track of my needs. I started walking to the mailbox each afternoon more for the short breath of open sky than for the mail. I kept hoping to run into Linda and reset whatever story had been started. One day, I saw her at the corner with another neighbor, both of them holding their dogs on short leashes. Their conversation drifted toward silence as I approached. I smiled and asked about their day. Linda's face arranged itself into politeness, and then fell slack again. She said something about busy schedules, and then looked past me at a tree as if it held a better answer. I nodded, folded the flyers I had pulled from the box, and walked back to the house with a hollow feeling in my gut. That evening, Rebecca announced without looking at me that the dishwasher would run at night and that it would be better if I rinsed my dishes in the bathroom sink so the kitchen could stay clean. She said it in the pleasant tone people use when giving directions to a stranger. Dan ate quickly and left the table with his phone in his hand. Ethan lingered, pushing peas around his plate, glancing at me as if he wanted to say something but had misplaced the words. I recorded the day in my notebook. I wrote the date, the details of the pantry latch, the missing bread, the labeled shelves, the walk to the mailbox, and the stilled conversation. I wrote the exact sentences that had been delivered to me in that gentle voice that carried the power to box me in. The act of writing steadied me like placing stones across a river so I could cross back and forth without slipping. The next morning, Rebecca had moved the kettle and the tea to a higher shelf. She said Ethan had been trying to reach it and that safety came first. The kettle was light metal, easy to lift, and for a moment I imagined it in my hands again, water rolling to a boil, steam rising in familiar curls. I left it where it was and filled a glass at the bathroom sink. It tasted faintly of metal. I drank it anyway. On the third day after the dinner confrontation, a woman from the Homeowners Association left a welcome newsletter at the door. Rebecca placed it on the counter next to a pile of bills. The flyer listed a neighborhood potluck at the park and a community board meeting. I picked it up and said the potluck might be a nice way to meet people. Rebecca said quickly that the potluck was for dues-paying members only. She said homeowners had priority. She slid the flyer closer to her side of the counter and smiled without showing teeth. I felt my cheeks grow warm. The deed with my name on it might as well have been invisible. The log in my notebook grew thicker. I added times and names. Day 4. Pantry locked at breakfast labels on fridge kettle moved. Day 5. Blanket missing vitamins switched remote without batteries. Day 6. Linda and neighbor paused conversation when I approached both dogs tugging to move on. I drew a small box next to each line and checked it off a private system that made the record look orderly, even if I did not feel that way. Late one afternoon, I heard footsteps on the porch and recognized Linda's lilting voice through the thin wall by the entryway. She stood in the doorway chatting with Rebecca. My name drifted out with a string of easy comments. Someone said the phrase hard to live with. Someone said older relatives can be a lot. There was a quick laugh, soft and conspiratorial. I stood in the hallway hidden by the curve of the wall and willed my face to stay calm. Dinner that night was quiet, a quiet that forced every sound to the surface. Ethan's fork tapped against the bowl. The refrigerator hummed. The ice maker dropped a few cubes with a hollow rattle. Dan ate with his phone beside his plate screen, lighting his hand. He finished, stood without a word, and walked to the back porch. The door clicked shut behind him. A moment later, I heard his voice. It carried more clearly outside where there were fewer walls to catch it. I did not mean to listen. At first, I only moved to the sink to rinse my dish, and I could not help hearing him. The night air made his words carry. He told someone that using my name had worked once. He said I barely checked my credit and that it would be fine to try again. He said just use the same signature that no one would notice. He kept his voice low, but the intent sharpened it. Then there was a pause and he said he would handle me. He said I would not be a problem for much longer. I stood with my hands in the warm water until it turned cold. I watched a soap bubble collapse in the drain and tried to slow my breathing. In the window over the sink, my reflection looked older than I remembered. Stronger, too, in a way that surprised me. I dried my hands and returned to my room without speaking to anyone. I opened my notebook and wrote down the words I had heard as exactly as I could. I recorded the time, the place on the back porch, the cadence of his voice. I wrote that he said my name had worked once. I wrote that he said, use the same signature. I wrote that he said, I barely checked my credit. I underlined those lines and closed the book gently as if sealing something volatile inside. The room felt small but not weak. I looked at the dresser drawer where I had tucked away my own papers, the ones that traveled with me from Savannah in a battered folder. The thought rose clean and quiet. In the morning, I would take them out and look again at what was true on the record, not just in the air between people. I placed the notebook under the mattress and set the small dinosaur back on its watch. The house settled into its usual noise, the cooling system breathing in and out, the occasional whisper of a car on the street. Somewhere in the hallway, Ethan laughed once, a quick, bright sound, and then it faded. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the stillness take shape around me. Tomorrow would be for paper and ink, and proof for facts that did not move when someone pushed. Tonight would be for holding steady. Morning light found the edges of the blinds and laid pale bands across the carpet. I dressed quietly and pulled the dresser drawer open, the one that stuck a little at the corner. Beneath a stack of sweaters lay the battered folder that had traveled with me from Savannah. The cardboard felt soft with age. I carried it to the bed and sat cross-legged, the room held together by the steady breath of the air conditioner. Inside the folder, a faint scent of paper and time rose up. I had labeled sections with masking tape years ago. Insurance, taxes, title, deed. My fingers went straight to deed. The top sleeve held a certified copy from the closing in the summer of 2021. I slid it free and smoothed it flat against the bedspread. The notary stamp was crisp. The recording information listed Orange County, Florida, with a book and page number and a recording date that matched the week I moved down. Seller names sat on the left and on the right. The grantee line carried my full name. Margaret M. Collins, a widowed woman. No commas with any other names. No and no joint tenants. No mention of Dan or Rebecca anywhere on the face of the document. I read it twice to be certain I was not missing a line. Then I traced the margin where the preparer had typed the parcel identification number and the property address. There was a small embossed seal from the title company in the lower corner. Sunshine Title and Escrow. I remembered the office. Faux palms in the lobby and a receptionist who offered me a peppermint from a bowl shaped like a seashell. I remembered signing with a pen that had the company logo on it, the ink, a smooth black that did not blot. No one else had signed with me, not on the deed. The memory rose clear and solid. Beneath the deed lay the closing disclosure, 5 pages of numbers and lines that had once made my eyes cross. I read them slowly now. Cash from buyer after credit sat on the final page, and there was my cashier's check from the sale in Savannah applied in neat type. The lender page showed a small balance with First Coast lending, nothing like the large loans I had feared taking at my age. My name appeared on the promissory note copy that followed single borrower, single signature. The payment coupons showed only my information. Staring at those lines steadied me. If there had been a plan to bring others onto the title later, it had never happened on paper. I kept going. A declarations page from the homeowner's insurance listed named insured as Margaret M. Collins. The mortgagee clause referred to First Coast lending proof that any bank interested in this house would need to pass through me. Tucked in the back sleeve, I found a yellow sticky note in my handwriting from the week after the closing. Call property appraiser to confirm homestead. I flipped to a printed screenshot from the county website dated 2 weeks later. Owner name printed at the top in all caps. Collins Margaret M. Mailing address matched the house. Status showed homestead applied. I had done what I set out to do, then tuck legal details around myself like a belt and suspenders, because paperwork is how you keep a life from sliding. I sat back and breathed, letting the relief expand and settle. The facts were on my side. The deed that mattered lived in the county records with my name alone. The insurance bill came to me. The tax receipts bore my name. The mortgage coupons came to my post office box and to my email. Nothing in this stack connected title to Dan or Rebecca. Whatever they told themselves at night did not change the ink on these pages. Memory carried me to a conversation from months before the closing. I saw Rebecca at my old kitchen table in Savannah, cheerful voice-printed listings laid out in rows. "It will be easier if the house ends up in our names," she had said then, insurance-wise, tax-wise, less to worry about later. I heard myself answer that we could revisit after the move when we were settled because the insurance quote had come back lower when calculated against my age, and credits and moving fast had saved us a few $100s a year. Then the move swallowed the days, and the revisiting never came. Perhaps they had assumed time would do the work that signatures had not. But time does not sign deeds. People do. I had not. I stacked the documents back into the folder in the same order I had found them then, set the folder beside me, and picked up my notebook. I wrote the date and a line that tasted like iron in my mouth. Warranty deed recorded 2021 lists me as sole owner. Closing disclosure note insurance taxes all in my name. No record anywhere of Dan or Rebecca as owners. I underlined the word sole owner until the pen pressed a groove into the paper. I closed my eyes and pictured the bank papers from the day before. Fake signature wrong, email phone number off by 1 digit. Identity pulled like a thread they thought I would not notice. The contrast between those lies and the deed in my lap felt like stepping from a slick floor onto solid ground. I could stand here. I could make decisions from here. A quiet thrill rose in my chest and then settled into something steadier. Power in a young person can be loud. At my age, it felt quiet and heavy, like a key I had forgotten I owned. The key did not unlock their better natures. It unlocked a plan. I folded the notebook closed and looked at the door. Down the hall, I could hear Rebecca opening and closing cabinets, as if still rearranging the house to erase me from its habits. Somewhere outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. The neighborhood smelled faintly of cut grass and sun-warmed asphalt when I opened the window an inch. I let the new air in and sat with my thoughts. Charging into the kitchen waving papers would satisfy something sharp and immediate, but it would not change the path we were on. The better course would be careful. I would need a witness and a guide who knew these pages as well as I did. Tom Grant came to mind then with the clarity of a name that had been waiting. He had helped me after Richard died, the kind of lawyer who explained things without talking down to you. I still had his card in the folder under a paperclip. I slid the card free and set it on the bedspread. The print had faded a little on the phone number, but it was legible. I would call him after lunch when the house was quiet and make an appointment. I would bring the deed, the closing disclosure, the insurance, and the bank's fraud affidavit. I would bring my notebook to a record of the days that had brought me to this point, so I would not forget a detail when the room got busy. Before putting the folder away, I took photos of the most important pages with my phone. One by one, steady hand clean edges in the frame. I emailed them to my own account and to a new folder I had set up with a simple name. Then I slid the phone into my pocket and felt its weight not for comfort, but for certainty. A small knock sounded at the door. Ethan's face peeked in, cheeks flushed from play. He asked if we could draw a map of pirate treasure later. I told him yes, that after his homework we would spread out on the floor with markers and make a map worth hours of searching. He grinned and ran down the hall. His footsteps faded toward the living room. I listened to that light sound until it disappeared. When the house settled again, I put the folder back under the sweaters and pushed the drawer closed. In the mirror above the dresser, I caught my reflection and hardly recognized the steadiness in my eyes. It was not triumph. It was resolve wearing my face. I spent the late morning in small tasks that would not draw attention. I mended a loose button. I wiped the window ledge. I walked a letter to the mailbox and stood for a minute under the unforgiving sun just to feel the firmness of the sidewalk under my shoes. At noon, I returned to my room and ate the yogurt with my name in marker on the lid. The tart sweetness grounded me. The house grew quiet after lunch. Rebecca left for errands. Dan had gone earlier. Ethan was at school. I took out Tom's card and dialed the number with careful fingers. When the receptionist answered, I asked if Tom had a few minutes today or tomorrow for a former client needing advice on a property matter. She put me on a brief hold and then came back with a time the next afternoon. I thanked her and wrote the appointment in my notebook with a box beside it that I would check when the moment came. I hung up and sat very still, listening to the air move through the vents. A bird landed on the sill and then flew off the soft thud of its feet, hardly more than a whisper. I reached for the plastic dinosaur and held it in my palm. The chipped tail scratched my skin lightly, a small, honest imperfection in a room that had tried to make me doubt my senses. The plan would begin with a conversation in an office with glass walls and tidy files. It would not begin in our kitchen with another argument. I placed the dinosaur back on its watch and smoothed the bedspread with the flat of my hand. The edges of fear did not vanish, but they receded enough for thought to take their place. By late afternoon, the house filled again with ordinary sounds. A car door closed, keys jingled, a cabinet door tapped shut. I tucked the folder deep and straightened the drawer so no one would guess it had been disturbed. Then I stood and breathed once deep and steady, holding in my mind the clear image of that line on the page that could not be argued away. Owner of record. My name alone. Power returned to where it had always lived, written in ink that would not smudge. I turned off the light and let the room slip into its familiar dim. The air conditioner exhaled. Somewhere down the block, a mower started and then faded. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet gather. Tomorrow I would walk into an office with my papers and ask for the next right step. Tonight, I would hold the knowledge of what was mine and plan the rest with care. The next afternoon, the sky over Orlando was a pale blue that looked brittle. I drove to an office park near the hospital district where the buildings were low and the parking spaces painted too bright. The plaque beside the door read, "Grant and Associates," in letters that had seen a lot of sun. Inside the waiting room was cool and smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. A secretary with kind eyes took my name and asked if I needed water. I said I was fine. My folder felt heavy in my lap, like I was holding all the years I had spent learning to keep records. Tom came out in a gray suit that fit looser than it used to. His hair had thinned and gone white at the temples, but his posture still had the easy care of a man who respected his clients enough to meet them halfway. He shook my hand with both of his and said he was glad to see me, even if he wished it were for something happier. He led me into his office where a framed print of a sailboat hung over the bookshelf. He gestured to a chair and waited until I was settled before he sat. I set the folder on his desk and told him what had happened. I spoke slowly so that I would not lose the thread. I said that the bank had called about a loan application for $240,000 against the house. I said that the signature was not mine and that the file had an email and phone I did not use. I told him about the conversation at the dinner table and how I had announced that I was recording so everyone would be careful with their words. Then I opened the folder and showed him the deed, the closing disclosure, the insurance declarations, the tax record printout, the note and coupons, and the affidavit I had signed at the bank. He read without rushing. He had always read like that, pencil in hand, tapping the margin when something needed attention. He held the deed to the light and nodded once. He pointed to the grantor and grantee lines and said that this instrument reflected a sole ownership. He said that in the eyes of the county and the state, I was the owner of record. He said that anyone else living at the property, even if they were family, was a permissive occupant unless there existed a written lease or a recorded interest. He flipped to the closing disclosure and the note. His pencil tapped again, and he said that the lender relationship was only between me and the bank. He wrote a short list on a legal pad and slid it a few inches toward me so I could see without reaching. He said the first step was to document the identity theft beyond what the bank already had. He wanted me to file an identity theft report with the federal site that aggregated those claims so we would have a formal case number. He said we should freeze my credit with the 3 major bureaus and request a fraud alert. He recommended adding a passphrase to my bank accounts and calling the mortgage servicer to add a verbal password before anyone could discuss my file. He mentioned changing email passwords, checking the post office box regularly, and using written communication as much as possible from this point forward. He then turned to the forged application and said that he would prepare a letter to the lender who had received the application stating that I disputed the validity and that any attempt to proceed would be contested. He said he would ask their counsel to preserve all records associated with the application, including IP addresses and any recorded calls. He said he would send me a copy and that I should keep it with the rest of my files. He added that if I heard of any attempt to use my name with a different lender, I should notify him at once, and he would add them to the notice. He asked if I had texts or emails related to the subject that showed pressure or admissions. I said most things had been said in the house. I told him I had begun a daily log and that I had captured a phone conversation that I announced in advance. He nodded and said that the recording I announced would be cleaner to use if we needed it, and that for the rest, the written log would be valuable. He reminded me that Florida had strict rules about consent for recordings, and said that we would lean on the paper and on the bank file because they were enough. He asked about safety. He wanted to know if I felt threatened in a way that required immediate action. I told him I felt a kind of ongoing pressure rather than an immediate danger, but that the words at dinner had shaken me. He said we would draft a plan that could escalate if that changed. He mentioned that as owner, I had remedies should I need to require someone to leave, but that we were not at that step yet. He advised that I avoid any confrontation and keep interactions brief and cordial until our letters had gone out and the bank had responded in writing. He paused, then tapped his pencil on a new blank page and began to outline something else. He said that it was time to update my estate documents. He reminded me gently that the last time we worked together had been after Richard died, and that the will we drafted back then had made sense when Dan was younger and our circumstances different. He recommended a new will and associated documents. He suggested that if I did not want Dan and Rebecca to inherit, I could make that explicit with clear language. He proposed specific bequests to organizations that mattered to me and a separate education trust for Ethan, so the decisions of his parents would not control whether he could use it. He said we could set a trustee who was not his parents and who would act in his best interest. He suggested a durable power of attorney and a healthcare surrogate designation to someone I trusted, perhaps Jean from my church, or an attorney at his firm who would act only under instruction. He said the goal was to put everything in writing so there would be no doubts later. The room felt very quiet as he spoke. I thought of Ethan's dinosaur watching from my nightstand and the crayon letters under my pillow. I said I wanted to leave something that could not be twisted into leverage. I told him I wanted a will that said clearly that Dan and Rebecca were not beneficiaries. I said I wanted to include a donation to the library back in Savannah and to the women's shelter where I had volunteered 2 summers, and that I wanted Ethan to have the chance to go to college if he wished. He nodded and made notes. He asked for the names of the charities and the addresses, and said he would draft the documents and have a notary present when I signed. He went back to the legal pad with the first list and added a few final items. He wanted me to request my credit reports, then write a simple letter to each bureau confirming the freeze so I would have paper evidence. He wanted me to photograph my driver license and Medicare card and keep the images in a secure folder in case any replacement became necessary. He said he would send me a checklist by email that evening so I would not have to trust my memory. He drafted an engagement letter and slid it across the desk. I read it and signed. The pen did not shake. He asked if I had a safe place to store the originals we were building. I told him I had a post office box already and a small storage locker under a different billing address. He said that was good and that he would keep a duplicate in his file as well. When the appointment ended, I stood and felt taller. Not younger and not unburdened, but steadier. Tom walked me to the door and said to come back tomorrow afternoon. He said that by then he would have the will packet ready for review and that the letter to the lender would have been sent certified. He clasped my hand again and added that I was not alone in this. Outside, the heat pressed close, but it no longer felt like it was pushing me down. I sat in the car and checked that the photos of the deed and the closing papers had uploaded to my email. I drove to the post office and bought a sheet of tracking labels. I mailed a copy of the bank affidavit to my own box in Savannah for redundancy. Then I drove home and parked 2 houses down so I could take an extra minute of air before stepping back into the performance that my son and his wife had chosen. Inside the house, the afternoon lay heavy and quiet. Rebecca was on the phone in the hallway, speaking in the relaxed voice she saved for friends. I passed without interrupting and went to my room. I set the folder back in its place and opened the notebook. I wrote the time of my meeting, the items Tom had listed, and the plan for tomorrow. At the bottom of the page, I wrote that the will would be rewritten and that Ethan's future would be protected regardless of what adults decided to do to one another. I put the notebook away and sat very still. The air conditioner clicked and resumed its steady breath. In the distance, I thought I heard the school bus, a high hiss of brakes, then the shout of children pouring out like water. I imagined Ethan's small face looking for me and felt my chest ache with both love and caution. The plan would not include using him. The plan was to build a structure strong enough that nothing cruel could push through it. I stood and washed my hands at the bathroom sink. I changed into a clean blouse and added a small spritz of the lavender perfume I had saved for church. Old habits can hold you up when new life tries to bend you. I checked my phone and saw an email arrive from Tom's office with a subject line about next steps. The list was neat and short. I breathed in and felt the ground under my feet again. I could move inside this plan. I could carry it without spilling. The light outside the window shifted as a cloud passed. I heard the front door open and Ethan's voice call out from the hallway. I turned off the bathroom light and rested my hand for a moment on the top edge of the dresser where the folder hid. Then I stepped back into the room and waited for the next knock, ready to hold my face calm and my papers close until it was time to sign what needed signing. I spent the next morning on the phone with my credit report spread across the bed like a map. Tom's email had arrived with a tidy checklist. I followed it step by step because obedience to a plan felt like oxygen. I placed fraud alerts with the 3 bureaus and set a full freeze. I requested mailed copies of my reports and then wrote short letters confirming each freeze so I would have a paper trail beyond confirmation numbers that could vanish into the ether. I added a passphrase to my checking and called the mortgage servicer to place a verbal password on my loan. The woman on the line asked for the phrase twice to make sure she typed it correctly. I chose a word that had lived only in my marriage, something no one in this house would guess. At the kitchen doorway, Rebecca watched me hold the phone and a pen at the same time. She asked if everything was all right. I said I was cleaning up some insurance details. She smiled in a way that showed no teeth and said that was wise. Then she closed the pantry door and I heard the latch click again. By noon, I drove to a credit union on the other side of town where the clerks did not know my face. I opened a new checking account in the name on my driver's license and added my maiden name as an alternate because a woman who has lived a long time carries more than one version of herself. The teller printed temporary checks and handed me a debit card in a simple white sleeve. I moved a small amount from my main account, enough to cover a few months of quiet steps without drawing attention. I stood in the parking lot with the sun on my shoulders and felt the kind of relief that comes only from doing a small thing that means more than it looks. From there, I went to the post office to sign the identity theft report Tom had recommended. The form asked questions that made my stomach knot. I answered each with care. I requested the official letter that would state a case number and mailed copies to my own post office box and to Tom's office. I bought a small book of tracking stickers and pressed one onto every envelope I sent. Numbers anchor memory when people start arguing with it. I stopped by the storage facility on Colonial, where fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and a manager with a radio clipped to his belt checked my code. The unit smelled faintly of cardboard and coal dust. I placed a plastic bin on the concrete and began filling it with what I had smuggled out in my tote over the last week. Richard's cufflinks, my mother's locket, the antique pie plate that baked so many peach pies the glaze had crazed into a delicate web. I wrapped each item in paper and labeled the bin in a plain hand. Kitchen heirlooms. On the second trip, I brought photo albums and the small box of letters from my first years teaching. On the third trip, I slid in a slim fireproof envelope with photocopies of the deed, the tax record, the insurance declaration, and Tom's engagement letter. I locked the unit and tugged twice to make sure the bar had seated. The metal sounded certain. Back at the house, I moved like a guest who knew how to avoid the squeaky floorboards. Rebecca stood by the door sorting mail. She held a card with a gold border and asked if I wanted to join them for a neighborhood barbecue on Saturday. Her voice carried a careful innocence. I said I had plans to meet with an old friend. She shrugged and turned away. The card slid into a stack on the counter that did not include my name. In my room, I set up a small station on the desk that had once been someone's office. I plugged in the printer I had found on the closet shelf and printed PDFs of the deed photos I had taken. I scanned the bank affidavit and saved it to a new folder on a fresh USB drive, then made a second copy on another. I labeled one with a small piece of tape in pen. House documents. The other I tucked into my purse without a label at all. Some things are better quiet. I opened my email and created a rule that would automatically send any message from Tom's office to both my inbox and my archive folder so I could not accidentally delete it in a moment of hurry. I sent myself a test message and watched the folders update. I felt like a school teacher again, arranging systems that would not fail young hands. In the late afternoon, Dan came home with a face like weather. He paused when he saw me at the small desk. He asked what I was working on. I said I was sorting old papers. He nodded once and told me he needed to take a call. His voice from the backyard came through the glass again. He told someone to be patient. He said things were in motion. He said he would get access soon. The words were quieter this time, but the shape of them was the same. I wrote the time in my notebook and kept my face even. I took a break around 5 and walked 2 blocks to a copy and print store near a laundromat. I paid cash to print an extra set of everything and asked the clerk for 2 manila envelopes. Back at home, I hid one set in the lining of my suitcase and slid the other into the space between the bottom drawer of the dresser and the frame. The drawer had always hung a little crooked. Now it had a reason. Tom called as the sky began to dim. He said the lender had acknowledged receipt of his letter and had agreed to preserve all application data. He confirmed that my identity theft case number had already populated in their portal through the bank referral. He said he would email me a draft of the will documents in the morning with the charity language and the education trust provisions. He reminded me to keep my interactions short and said that if anything escalated, we could discuss a protection order. I thanked him and told him I would be ready at 2 tomorrow with my driver's license and a calm hand. After the call, I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for dinner sounds that did not come. When I stepped into the kitchen, Rebecca had already fed Ethan and left a plastic container with my name on it near the microwave. I heated it and took it back to my room. The scent of garlic and tomatoes lifted and fell in the air. I ate slowly with the door slightly ajar so I could hear the life of the house without stepping into it. When the dishes were washed and the house had gone soft with evening, my phone rang again. The number was not local. I let it ring twice before I answered. A calm voice identified himself as Special Agent Miller with a federal office that handled financial crimes. He said the bank had submitted a referral and that my identity theft report had linked to it. He asked if I was in a place where I could speak privately. I said yes and closed the door gently. He asked for a summary in my own words. I kept it simple and chronological. First, the call from First National, then the forged application with the wrong phone and email, then the dinner confrontation and my announced recording, then the steps Tom and I had taken with the affidavits and the preservation letters. He asked if I had copies. I said I had both digital and paper with duplicates stored off-site. He asked about access to my personal documents in the house. I said that items had been moved and that I believed people inside the home had handled things they should not have. He asked if I felt unsafe. I answered truthfully that I felt pressure but not immediate physical danger. He said that could change, and that he wanted me to call if it did. He explained that the case was at the opening review stage. He said they would request records from the lender, including IP logs and any voice calls, and that they might ask the bank to hold the file until their review was complete. He asked for permission to contact Tom directly, and I gave it. He asked if I would be willing to provide a written statement and any relevant recordings with the consent notice included. I said yes. He asked if the recorded dinner conversation included my announcement. I said it did. He paused to make a note and then thanked me. Before he ended the call, he offered 2 pieces of advice in that quiet, official tone that has learned to move gently through homes like mine. He said not to confront anyone with accusations and not to reveal any step of the investigation. He said to keep my personal documents secured and to consider storing originals away from the property if that was not already the case. I told him I understood. He said someone would be in touch within a week with a formal case number and instructions for uploading documents through a secure portal. When the call ended, I stared at the dark screen and felt something lift off my chest. It was not joy. It was a shift of weight from my shoulders to a structure built for bearing it. The plan that had lived as whispers in my room had stepped into a room with badges and logging systems and rules that did not bend for family pressure. Whatever Dan had imagined, whatever late-night plans he had made on the back porch, with numbers and false names, had moved beyond the small power of this house. I wrote Agent Miller's name in my notebook and the time of the call. I added the words case opening and formal number pending. Then I closed the book and slid it under the mattress. The air conditioner exhaled in its familiar rhythm. Outside, a car door shut, and a laugh drifted from a yard down the street. I turned off the lamp and lay back. The house was still the same shape around me, but the ground beneath it had changed. I let my eyes close and felt for the first time in weeks that the thing tightening around my life had loosened a notch in the hands of the law. Dawn pressed against the blinds like a quiet reminder. I sat up, swung my feet to the floor, and knew the shape of the day without glancing at a clock. The small truck would come early. I dressed, tied my shoes with deliberate hands, and opened the dresser drawer that always stuck at the corner. The folder was there, and beside it, the 2 small USB drives, one labeled in my hand, one left blank. I put both into a cloth pouch and slid it into my purse. The notebook went next, along with my driver license, the new debit card from the credit union, and Tom's appointment card tucked into a side pocket. Outside, the street was still gray. Sprinklers whispered across a neighbor's lawn. I moved through the room, collecting what would leave with me and nothing that would betray the plan too soon. The photo album went into a canvas bag. The small plastic dinosaur disappeared into my coat pocket where I could feel its weight without seeing it. I took one last look at the thin blind, the beige carpet, the corner where the suitcase had leaned for too long. Then I zipped the suitcase, set it by the door, and waited for the soft rumble of an engine. The moving truck arrived exactly at 7. A young driver with careful eyes nodded at me in the driveway and said he would be quiet. I led him through the side gate so the front door would not creak. We carried out only what mattered: 2 boxes from the closet that held the framed photographs and the teaching mementos. The small trunk with Richard's cufflinks and my mother's locket already wrapped and labeled from the day before. A single suitcase with clothes folded thin. The rest of my life had been gently transferred to the storage unit in small trips that no one had noticed. Today was for the last pieces and for closing a door without using force. Inside the kitchen, I set the wooden box I had prepared on the table and opened it to check the contents. On top lay a certified copy of the warranty deed, the one with my name alone under owner of record. Beneath it sat the affidavit to the bank reporting the forged application, Tom's preservation letter, requesting that the lender maintain IP logs and recorded calls, and the identity theft case acknowledgement from the federal site. I placed one of the USB drives on top in a small velvet sleeve. Inside that drive were the photographs of the deed, my written log for the past weeks, and the recording of the dinner that I had announced for clarity. On the underside of the lid, I had taped a short letter I had typed and printed at the copy shop. It stated in clear words that the property belonged to me, that any attempt to use my name without consent had been reported, and that the appropriate offices held copies of everything enclosed. I did not sign it with flourish. I signed it like a fact. I closed the lid and centered the box on the table between a stack of unpaid bills and a bowl of bruised apples. The house felt oddly hushed, as if it had been holding its breath. I walked the rooms, once a quiet inventory. The labels on the refrigerator shelves looked smaller than they had when they were meant to shrink me. The pantry latch clicked when I touched it, a small sound without power. In the hallway, the family photographs they had chosen for the wall did not include me. I let that be what it was. The movers rolled out the final trunk and set it near the door. I tipped them with cash and thanked them for their quiet care. One of them nodded to the wooden box and asked if he should carry it too. I told him it belonged right there in the center of the table. He lifted his cap and left without another word. I stood in the kitchen and listened. No one had stirred. Dan slept heavy when he did sleep. Rebecca could drift between rooms like mist when she chose. Ethan would not have understood what this morning meant, and I did not want him to wake to an empty hall. I set the house key near the fruit bowl. The presence of it did not grant anyone rights or take mine away. It was simply a piece of metal that opened a door to a place that had never opened to me. At the threshold I paused. The air smelled of coffee that would not be poured for me. The blinds cast thin stripes across the floor. The box on the table looked small. For a heartbeat, a wave of memory rose, and I saw the day in Savannah when I had carried the last bag to the car and looked back at a porch that had held decades of evenings. That had been grief. This was not grief. This was release. I stepped out and pulled the door gently until the latch caught. The click sounded clean. In the driveway, the small truck idled with a patient rhythm. I climbed into the passenger seat of the car that would follow and rested my hands on the steering wheel, even though the engine was not yet on. Calm moved through me like a slow tide. The house behind me was only wood and drywall, and a list of things people had done inside it. It would be a record now, not a home. I drove behind the truck through the subdivision's bright sameness and onto the larger road. Palm fronds shook in the morning breeze, and the sky came up pale and wide. At a light, I checked my phone. Tom's email had landed with the draft documents and the address for the notary. He would see me at 2. I sent a short confirmation and returned the phone to the console. The truck turned toward the storage facility for the last drop. I parked and signed the final form while the driver stacked my boxes neatly. He handed me a clipboard. I wrote my name once more, the real curve of it steady and familiar. He wished me a good day and drove off. The quiet that followed felt earned. From there I headed north. The highway unrolled like ribbon and the miles slipped behind. I had arranged the apartment last week after an agent sent photos and a video walkthrough. The place was furnished on the 12th floor of a senior living building that looked out over a bend in the river in Jacksonville. The lease had been signed through a secure portal and the deposit wired from the new account at the credit union. It had felt surreal at the time, like sketching a life in pencil. This morning it felt like tracing it in ink. By late morning, I pulled under the canopy, and a clerk at the front desk greeted me with a practiced kindness that did not sting. He retrieved a small envelope with a key card and a welcome packet, and showed me to the elevator. The hallways smelled faintly of citrus cleaner. The door to my unit opened onto a living room with soft chairs and a wide window. Sunlight bounced off the river and laid a path across the floor. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and placed the canvas bag on the table. I walked the room slowly, palms brushing the backs of chairs as if greeting them. There was a bedroom with a bed that did not sag, a small study with a desk that waited for paper, a kitchen with a kettle on the stove, and 2 blue mugs stacked neatly. I boiled water and made tea out of habit, watched the steam rise, and breathed it in. The apartment did not smell like anyone else's life. It smelled like possibility. I unpacked only what I needed. The photo of Richard went on the windowsill where the light could catch him. The album lay on the coffee table. The notebook slid into the desk drawer within easy reach. The cloth pouch with the USB drives went into the small safe behind the closet shelf that the clerk had shown me. I tested the combination twice and wrote it in a place only I would look. The plastic dinosaur came out of my pocket and stood on the bedside table facing the door like a sentinel. I texted Tom that I had arrived safely and would meet him at 2. He replied within minutes that the notary would be ready and that he had received a notice from the lender confirming a hold on the application. I sat at the small desk and wrote the details in my notebook line, straight letters, careful. Then I closed it and stood by the window. Far below, a boat drifted past, leaving a thin wake that spread and then softened. The city sounded different from the suburb. It had a low, constant murmur that felt like company rather than intrusion. I drank my tea and let the warmth settle in my chest. The room felt steady under my feet. The bed behind me would hold me without resisting. In the quiet, I could hear the small internal click of a decision finished. I had left without a scene. I had left with my documents, my dignity, and a wooden box that told the truth sitting on a table in a kitchen that no longer asked for me. I washed the mug and set it back to dry. I checked the time and gathered what I would need for the afternoon. Driver license, pen, phone, the folder that proved where my life began and ended on paper. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and lingered for a second in the hallway as if listening to a new house take its first breath with me inside it. The elevator doors opened with a soft bell. I stepped in and watched the numbers fall toward the lobby, feeling an unfamiliar ease settle across my shoulders like a shawl I had almost forgotten I owned. I stepped into the afternoon heat and drove to Tom's office with my folder on the seat beside me like a companion. The notary was waiting with calm hands and a witness with a tidy signature. We reviewed each page slowly. The new will named charities that had held me up when I needed holding. The education trust for Ethan stood apart from any control by his parents. The durable power of attorney and healthcare papers put decisions in hands I trusted. I signed every line with the same steady hand I had used to sign report cards and permission slips for decades. When it was done, Tom gathered the originals, placed certified copies in a sealed envelope for me, and said he would file what needed filing. He walked me to the door and reminded me again that I was not alone. Back at the apartment, the river flashed like a silver thread beyond the window. I set the envelope in the safe and checked that my phone was on silent only for unknown numbers. I made tea and stood watching the steam rise. At the hour when Dan usually came home, the first call arrived. His name lit the screen. I watched it blink and fade. A second call followed and went unanswered. Then a third. A text came through asking where I was. Another asking if I had taken certain items. Then a short string of words that read like someone trying to find the edges of a reality they had not planned for. I walked to the table and opened my notebook. I wrote the time of the first call, then the second and the third. I noted the texts and that I did not reply. I set the phone face down and breathed. Soon after, an email from the lender arrived. It stated that the application under my name had been placed on hold pending review and that no further action would be taken without written confirmation from me. A separate notice from the bank's fraud department confirmed the case file and the preservation of logs. I printed both at the small desk printer and slid them into a fresh folder marked with the date. It felt like placing bricks in a wall that would not fall. Tom called in the evening. His voice carried the kind of quiet I was learning to measure. He had received a response from the lender's counsel confirming preservation and suspension. He mentioned a separate call from a compliance officer at the hospital where Rebecca worked. He did not share details beyond public procedure, but he said the hospital had placed an employee on administrative leave pending an outside investigation into a financial matter that had touched their records. He reminded me that we were to say nothing. I thanked him and wrote 2 lines in my notebook. Lender hold confirmed. Employer action noted. The next morning, my phone filled with missed calls before I made the bed. Dan left a voicemail where breath did most of the talking. He said we needed to fix this. He said the house was a mess and demanded to know where I had gone. He sounded less angry than unmoored. I set the phone down and opened the curtains. Sunlight puddled on the floor in a way that made the room look new again. I ate breakfast and let the calls roll over the silence. By the second day, the rhythm of consequence found its steps. A certified letter arrived at my post office box, confirming the freeze on my credit and listing the dates by bureau. Another letter from the bank thanked me for the affidavit and reminded me to call if I saw any unfamiliar transactions. Agent Miller left a short message that the case had moved from opening to review and that subpoenas for records had been issued. He said someone would contact me to arrange a formal statement and that he appreciated the clarity of my logs. I wrote his update with clean lines and underlined the word review. That afternoon, Linda's number appeared on my screen, an old Savannah contact who had a way of knowing things without sounding like gossip. She said she had heard from a mutual acquaintance that the hospital had posted temporary staffing for Rebecca's unit. She asked if I was safe where I was. I told her I was fine, and that a good lawyer had reminded me to talk only about my own steps. She said that sometimes the best thing a person can do is stop being fertilizer for someone else's bad garden. After we hung up, I smiled for the first time in days. On the third morning, the tone of Dan's messages changed. There were more of them closer together, as if urgency had become a drumbeat. He said lawyers were asking questions. He said the bank would not return his calls. He said he needed to talk to me right now. I kept my phone on the table with the screen dim and the ringer off. I walked to the window, opened it a few inches, and let river air cool the room. Around noon, Agent Miller called with a measured update. He said he could not share names or details, but that an interview had been scheduled with a relevant party in Orlando, and that he might reach out to me after that conversation. He reminded me to preserve all messages. I told him I had backed everything up on 2 drives and stored one off-site. He said that kind of preparation saved time. After the call, I sat very still and let the calm of being believed settle into my bones. Late that afternoon, notification after notification stacked on my screen. Missed call, missed call, missed call. The list scrolled until it said only more than 99. The thread of messages ran like a river in flood. Some were fragmented apologies. Some were explanations with holes in them. Some were attempts to pull me back into an argument so familiar we could have conducted it in our sleep. I felt that old tug, and then felt it end. The thread no longer had the power to move me. I opened the file folder on the desk and selected the audio recording from the dinner. I knew the exact moment within it. The scrape of a chair, the rattle of a spoon, the voice that rose and said the thing that could not be unsaid. I did not need to hear it again. I attached the file to a message addressed only to Dan. I typed one sentence with hands that did not shake. I told him this was the record he could not dispute. I pressed send and set the phone down. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Then 3 dots appeared as he typed and erased and typed and erased again. A message finally arrived. It said he did not mean it. It said he had been under stress. It said the words were not fair. It said I was his mother. I read the lines once and felt nothing break inside me. Nothing needed to break. What could break had broken already in a kitchen where spoons jumped and a child flinched. I opened the settings and blocked his number. I blocked the alternate number he had used before. I muted the thread so the phone would not light the room with a glow that felt like pleading. I placed the phone face down and walked to the sink to wash my mug. Warm water ran over my hands. Outside, a boat horn sounded far downriver. The apartment smelled faintly of tea and clean paper. That evening, Tom called to confirm another step. He had received notice that the lender had forwarded records to the federal office. He said he had also been told by opposing counsel that a subject had been requested to appear for an interview within the week. He cautioned me that pressure might build in messages and that my best response was no response. I told him I had already sent the only reply I intended to send. He exhaled and said that would do. I slept through the night for the first time since Orlando. In the morning, I walked to the river path behind the building and sat on a bench watching sunlight ripple on the water. A woman with a paperback nodded hello. An older gentleman fed bread to gulls and laughed softly when they darted. Ordinary life kept its appointments with or without the drama of a single house. When I returned to the apartment, there were new voicemails. I did not listen to them. I opened my notebook instead and recorded the dates and times and the count that had pushed past the little plus sign on the screen. I wrote a single sentence beneath the list. Silence can be a boundary. Then I closed the book and set it on the desk. In the early afternoon, Agent Miller called again. His tone was unchanged. He said that interviews had been scheduled and that he would contact me with next steps after his team finished their review. He reminded me to stay where I felt safe and to call local authorities if anything immediate arose. I thanked him and said I would. After we ended the call, I stood a long moment by the window and watched a storm drift in from the west dark clouds, stacking over the river until rain moved across the surface like brushed silk. As evening came, one last message from Dan slid through from a number I did not recognize. It began like an apology and ended like a demand. I watched it sink among the rest without replying. I turned the phone off completely and listened to the rain find its rhythm against the glass. The room was quiet. The box on the kitchen table in Orlando would still be where I left it, small and heavy with the kind of truth that does not rush. The law had stepped into the space between us. I did not need to occupy it anymore. Morning broke clean and bright over the river. I brewed tea in the small kettle, watched the steam rise, and carried the cup to the window where sunlight scattered in broken lines across the water. I turned my phone on long enough to scan for any messages from Tom or Agent Miller. There were none. I left it face down on the table, a quiet tool rather than a tether. The building eased into its morning routine around me. A cart rattled softly down the hall. Somewhere, a television murmured from behind a door. My new life sounded like ordinary days, and that felt like a luxury. I signed up for watercolor class on the 12th floor, a room with long tables and jars that held brushes like bouquets. The instructor had a gentle way of showing light where to land. She said to let the water do its work and not to force it. I practiced washes that bled into each other until they looked like mist. My roses still leaned toward cabbage and my clouds toward potatoes, but each sheet of paper felt like proof that a different kind of time had begun. In the afternoons, I walked the river path behind the building. A woman named Carol often sat on the same bench with a paperback folded in her hand. She had a cat that watched the gulls from the window of her unit. We spoke in soft pieces and traded finished books every week. A man with a newsboy cap swore by the crossword in the morning paper and left copies at the front desk for anyone who wanted them. We were a small constellation of strangers whose lives overlapped without taking from each other. It was enough. A week later, a white envelope waited in my post office box, the letters on the front drawn carefully in a child's hand. Inside, I found a sheet of paper torn from a sketchbook. Markers had bled a little, each line earnest. Ethan had drawn a pirate map that began with a house and ended at a tree with an X, In the corner, he had printed Grandma Loves Treasure and signed his name with a flourish. My throat tightened so fast I had to sit on the bench against the wall. I held the page until my fingers warmed it, then slid it into a plastic sleeve from the stationery shop down the street. Back at the apartment, I called Tom's office and asked if a postcard would be acceptable. He said a single card with a simple message was fine. I bought one with a watercolor of the river and wrote that I was safe, that I loved him, and that I was proud of his brave maps. I addressed it to the house in Orlando and mailed it without return address beyond my box. That weekend, the building organized a day trip to the museum, and I went along learning the bus driver's name and the rhythm of the stoplights on Riverside Avenue. A flyer in the lobby advertised a short coastal cruise leaving from the port 2 nights up and back, with a stop in Savannah. The idea made me smile. I signed up on impulse and packed lightly. A book, a sweater, the small dinosaur wrapped in a handkerchief because old habits have their reasons. On the first evening on deck, a man stood a few feet away, looking out toward the line where the sky pressed down on the sea. He was tall in the way that made age look dignified rather than reduced. He had a gentle jaw and eyes lined by years spent squinting into wind. He introduced himself as Samuel Reed from Maine. He said he had lost his wife 10 years earlier and still caught himself cutting fruit the way she liked it. I told him about Richard in pieces that fit the night air. We walked the deck twice without running out of simple things to say. Samuel had a quiet respect for edges. He did not ask questions he had not earned. He did not offer advice I did not request. He noticed when wind caught my scarf and passed it back without flourish. We ate at the same table the second night because the staff thought we were traveling together. We were not, but there was comfort in being mistaken for people who had found a kind way to share silence. He told me his daughter lived up north and called when she remembered, which he accepted without bitterness. I told him I taught children how to read for 30 years, and that sometimes I still heard the lilt of their voices when I closed my eyes. When the ship returned to Jacksonville, he handed me a card with his email. He said if I ever wanted to trade book titles or weather reports, he was willing. I said yes. Back home, a letter from Agent Miller waited in my mailbox. It confirmed that subpoenas had been issued and that I would be contacted if a formal statement was needed beyond what I had already provided. Another envelope from Tom's office held certified copies of the will and the trust. I placed them in the safe and wrote the date in my notebook, then checked the small box I had drawn beside the task weeks ago. The sound of the pen on paper had the weight of closure. Watercolor class became a small anchor. My hands found their way into new routines. On Tuesdays, I joined a reading circle at the library downtown, where the chairs were scuffed and the discussion warm. I took the bus because I wanted my days to include places where strangers still made room for each other. On Fridays, the building cafeteria served peach cobbler that tasted the way summer used to taste when I was young. I learned the names of the kitchen staff and tipped my head to the maintenance man who fixed a stubborn drawer in my dresser with 2 precise turns of a screwdriver. Now and then, an unknown number would flash on my phone and then vanish. I stopped saving them or counting them. The silence I offered in return was no longer an effort. It was a habit that respected my own limits. Once late in the afternoon, a message arrived that mentioned Ethan by name and set a court date like a threat without context. I forwarded it to Tom without comment. His reply said only he would handle it. I returned to my brush and my paper and painted the line of the river as it looked from my window imperfect and bright. Ethan sent a second drawing in early spring. A boat with a flag the color of tomatoes, and a figure at the bow with gray hair that stood like grass. In the corner he had written that the treasure was not gold, but safe. I pressed my lips to the paper and let my hands stop shaking before I slid it into its sleeve. I wrote another postcard that said I was watching the river and that when the light hit right, it looked like spilled coins. I added that maps work best when you trust your own compass. I mailed it and walked home slowly through the late sun. Samuel wrote from Maine and then from Georgia, where he visited a friend. He said the lilacs were coming in and that the wind off the harbor still had teeth. I wrote back with book titles and the way the river looked after rain. We met for coffee once when he came through town on a longer trip. We sat by the window of a small cafe where the owner knew how to pull a shot without insulting the beans. We spoke the way people do when they are careful with what matters and brave enough to be plain. When we stood to leave, he squeezed my hand lightly, and I did not feel the need to explain the shape of anything beyond that. On a warm evening in May, I walked the path behind the building and thought about the word that had followed me for months. Revenge had sounded sharp when I first touched it, like something that could cut me too if I held it wrong. Justice felt different. It had edges that protected rather than pierced. What I wanted had never been payback. It had been the return of my name to my own mouth, the return of my home to the record where it belonged, the return of my breath to a pace I could keep. Those had come back to me piece by careful piece, signed and sealed and filed. When I returned to the apartment, a small package waited at my door. Inside was a notebook with a blue cover and a note from the watercolor instructor that said to keep letting the water do its work. I opened to the first blank page and painted a simple line across it, thin and uncertain at first, then firmer, then fading into a wash that spread without fear. I dated the corner and closed the cover. I sold my house for my child because I believed that is what mothers do when the road bends. What I received in return was not gratitude or shelter, but betrayal dressed as need. The twist was not a trick of fate. It was an old truth written on a deed that I finally read with both eyes open. I took back what was mine on paper and in spirit, and I set down what was not mine to carry. In the space that opened, a life grew. Small meals eaten by a window. New friends who remembered to ask and listen. A boy who sent maps across distance that no longer hurt. A man who offered a steady conversation without reaching for possession. If you are listening and you feel the slow pull of a story like mine inside your chest, hear this. Your worth is not measured by how much you disappear for the comfort of others. Your dignity does not belong to anyone else's ledger. Protect your name, your papers, your voice. Ask for copies. Keep a notebook. Tell the truth even when it is small and steady rather than loud. Build boundaries that love can respect. And if this story helps you or someone you love stay with me here, share your own compass in the comments and subscribe so you do not have to walk the next hard mile alone.